Have you ever tried something simple in your relationship? You stop initiating sex for a while just to see what happens. And suddenly, nothing happens. Days go by, sometimes weeks. And you begin to wonder whether she even thinks about intimacy the way you do. For many men, that moment feels confusing and even a little painful, because it starts raising questions about attraction, chemistry, and whether something in the relationship has quietly shifted. But here's the truth that surprises a lot of men. The reason women rarely initiate sex often has very little to do with attraction itself. In fact, many men unknowingly create the exact dynamic that discourages women from initiating intimacy in the first place. And once you see how those dynamics work, you'll understand why it happens and how to change it. Let's start with a pattern many men create without realizing it. Imagine a typical evening. You're sitting on the couch. She leans into you. You wrap your arm around her. She rests her head on your shoulder. At first it feels warm and natural, just closeness. But then something happens. Your hand starts moving. The kiss gets deeper. The moment slowly turns into an attempt to push things further. Now, here's the problem most men never notice. If this happens every single time, a pattern begins to form in her mind. Cuddle leads to sex. Kissing leads to sex. Touch leads to sex. Over time, something subtle but powerful starts happening psychologically. She begins to avoid initiating intimacy altogether. Not because she doesn't enjoy closeness, not because she doesn't want you, but because she knows where it usually ends. This is a classic form of behavioral conditioning. When one action constantly leads to pressure or expectation, the brain learns to avoid starting that action in the first place. So instead of initiating affection, she waits. She lets you start things. Because if she doesn't begin it, she doesn't have to manage the moment where it suddenly turns sexual before she's ready. Many women actually want physical closeness during the day. They want to cuddle. They want affection. They want to feel close to you without it automatically turning into a sexual negotiation. But when every small gesture becomes a doorway to sex, something surprising happens. Affection disappears first. And when affection disappears, initiation disappears with it. In other words, the very pressure men create in order to get more intimacy often produces the opposite result. She stops initiating. Not because she has no desire, but because starting intimacy feels like opening a door she may not want to walk through every time. And this leads to a deeper realization that most men have never been taught. Because the truth is, women experience sexual desire very differently from men. Most men grow up believing sexual desire works the same way for everyone. You see something attractive. You feel arousal. You want sex. Simple. Immediate, direct. For many men, desire behaves like a switch. It turns on quickly. But for many women, desire doesn't work like a switch. It works more like a slow ignition. Instead of spontaneous desire appearing out of nowhere, female desire is often responsive. It grows out of context, emotional atmosphere, and physical closeness. In other words, the sequence is often reversed. For many men, the order is desire first, intimacy second. For many women, the order can be connection first, arousal second, desire after that. This difference has been studied in modern sexual psychology. Researchers like Dr. Emily Nagoski, known for her work on female sexual desire, describe something called responsive desire, a pattern where desire develops in response to stimulation, closeness, or emotional connection rather than appearing spontaneously. That means many women don't start the evening already feeling turned on. They become turned on as intimacy builds. And this is where a lot of men accidentally sabotage the process. Because when a man rushes directly toward the end goal, he skips the very phase where female desire is still waking up. Think about the type of romantic or erotic content that many women enjoy. It rarely jumps straight into explicit action. There's tension, eye contact, slow moments, Anticipation, a build-up. That build-up is not just storytelling. It mirrors how female arousal often unfolds in real life. But many men approach intimacy like a race with a finish line. They escalate quickly, they move fast, and without realizing it, they skip the emotional and sensory build-up that actually fuels female desire. Ironically, when a man learns to slow down, the dynamic begins to flip. When he allows moments to breathe, when he creates anticipation instead of rushing past it, when closeness doesn't automatically become pressure, something interesting starts happening. The tension begins to build on her side. She starts thinking about you later. She starts replaying moments in her head. And eventually, she becomes the one who starts leaning closer first. Because desire has had time to grow instead of being forced into existence. But even this psychological difference isn't the whole story. Biology also plays a powerful role in why men and women approach sexual initiation so differently. There's another factor quietly shaping this dynamic, and this one sits deeper than psychology. Biology, specifically hormones. One hormone in particular plays a major role in sexual drive and pursuit behavior: testosterone. Testosterone is strongly linked to libido. It influences the brain regions connected to reward, motivation, and sexual arousal. It also affects how quickly sexual desire is triggered. And this is where one of the biggest biological differences between men and women appears. Men produce significantly higher levels of testosterone than women. In fact, male testosterone levels can be several times higher on average. This hormone is responsible for many male sexual characteristics, but it also fuels a stronger baseline drive towards sexual pursuit. Higher testosterone is associated with increased sexual thoughts, stronger libido, and a greater tendency to act on sexual impulses. In simple terms, it creates urgency. This helps explain why men often feel desire more frequently and more suddenly. The brain receives a stimulus, something attractive, a physical cue, a visual trigger, and the system activates quickly. But for women, testosterone levels are much lower. Women do produce testosterone in the ovaries and adrenal glands, but in far smaller quantities. As a result, sexual desire tends to be less impulsive and less aggressive. It doesn't mean women don't experience desire. They absolutely do. But that desire is often less about immediate biological urgency and more about the environment around them. Where men often feel a strong internal push towards sex, women often respond more strongly to context. The emotional climate, the feeling of closeness, the sense of safety and attraction in the moment. So while a man might feel desire first and then look for an opportunity, a woman may experience desire after the environment has already become inviting. You could say the difference like this: men often experience sexual urgency. Women often respond to sexual invitation. And when men misunderstand this difference, they sometimes assume something is wrong. They assume the attraction is fading. They assume their partner simply doesn't want them anymore. But in many cases, the real issue isn't attraction at all. It's that female desire often depends on something even more powerful than biology: emotional connection. There is something many men underestimate when it comes to female desire: emotional safety. For a lot of women, sexual openness doesn't begin in the bedroom. It begins long before that, in the emotional atmosphere of the relationship. A woman who feels valued, respected, and emotionally connected to her partner is far more likely to express her desire freely. But when that emotional connection weakens, sexual initiation often disappears with it. Think about how a typical day unfolds for many couples. You both wake up. You rush to work. You handle responsibilities. You deal with stress, deadlines, messages, problems. By the time evening arrives, she may already feel mentally drained. Now imagine that during the day there was very little emotional connection. No real conversation. No meaningful attention. No small moments where she felt seen or appreciated. Then later that night, physical intimacy suddenly becomes the focus. For many women, the emotional gap between those two moments feels enormous. It's not that she doesn't care about you. It's not that attraction has vanished. It's that her emotional system hasn't been engaged yet. Many men unintentionally treat their partner primarily as a sexual partner during intimate moments, but overlook the emotional foundation that makes those moments possible. For women, desire is often connected to feeling valued as a person first, feeling heard, feeling appreciated, feeling like her presence matters beyond physical attraction. When those emotional signals are strong, something interesting happens. Her defenses lower, her comfort increases, and with that comfort comes a willingness to express desire without hesitation. Because desire, for many women, grows in an environment where vulnerability feels safe. If a woman feels judged, ignored, or emotionally disconnected, she may still care deeply about her partner. But initiating sex requires a level of openness that doesn't exist in an emotionally cold environment. In contrast, when a woman feels emotionally secure, something shifts. She relaxes. She becomes more playful. She becomes more expressive. And eventually, she becomes more willing to take the first step herself. Because at that point, intimacy no longer feels like pressure. It feels like connection. But emotional safety isn't the only biological rhythm shaping female desire. There's another influence that men often overlook completely: timing. Women's bodies operate on a hormonal cycle that influences energy levels, mood, and sexual desire throughout the month. These changes are not random. They follow biological rhythms connected to fertility and hormone fluctuations. During certain phases of the menstrual cycle, libido can naturally rise. Around ovulation, when estrogen levels increase and the body enters its most fertile window, many women experience a noticeable shift. They may feel more flirtatious, more physically responsive, and more interested in intimacy. Some women even report feeling more confident, more playful, and more drawn to physical closeness during this period. In other words, their bodies are biologically more receptive to sexual interaction. But the opposite can also be true during other phases of the cycle. In the days leading up to menstruation, often referred to as PMS, many women experience fatigue, irritability, physical discomfort, or emotional sensitivity. During this time, sexual interest may drop significantly. It's not about attraction, it's about physiology. Hormones such as estrogen and progesterone shift throughout the month, influencing mood, energy, and the brain systems connected to desire. And on top of these biological rhythms, real life still happens. Stress at work, conflict with friends, a difficult day, mental overload. All of these factors can influence sexual mood as well. For many women, desire doesn't operate like a constant signal that stays at the same level every day. It's more like a tide that rises and falls depending on both biological timing and emotional context. Some days the conditions are naturally favorable. Other days, the system simply isn't there. Understanding this rhythm changes how you interpret her behavior. Instead of assuming rejection or loss of attraction, you begin to see that female desire often follows patterns that are cyclical and contextual. But even beyond biology and mood, there is another reason many women hesitate to initiate sex. And this one runs deep in the psychology of how women have been socially conditioned to approach intimacy. There is another reason many women hesitate to initiate sex, and it has very little to do with desire. It has to do with risk. For generations, the dating dynamic has been framed in a very specific way. Men are expected to pursue. Women are expected to be pursued. Even in modern relationships, that script still quietly shapes behavior. From an early age, many women are taught, directly or indirectly, that expressing too much sexual initiative can be interpreted in the wrong way. Too forward, too aggressive, too easy. Because of that, many women grow up learning to manage their sexual expression carefully. Not necessarily because they want to, but because of how it might be perceived. Now add another psychological layer to that. Rejection. For men, sexual rejection often hits the ego. It can feel embarrassing or frustrating, but it rarely attacks a man's core identity. For many women, the experience can feel different. Part of a woman's identity, historically and culturally, has been tied to desirability, the idea that being wanted is connected to her value. So when a woman takes the risk of initiating and the response isn't enthusiastic, the emotional interpretation can be much harsher. It doesn't just feel like a moment of rejection. It can feel like a judgment about her attractiveness, her femininity, or her worth. That emotional cost can be powerful enough to keep many women from taking the risk in the first place. So instead, they choose the safer route. They let the man initiate. That way, if intimacy happens, it happens without the vulnerability of having made the first move. And if it doesn't happen, they avoid the sting of personal rejection. This doesn't mean women lack desire. It means that expressing that desire sometimes carries a psychological risk they've been taught to avoid. And once that pattern becomes established in a relationship, it can quietly reinforce itself over time. She waits for you to initiate. You become used to initiating. And the dynamic stabilizes in that pattern. But there is another very practical factor that often kills sexual initiation long before any of these psychological dynamics even appear. Exhaustion. There is one more factor that quietly destroys sexual initiation in many relationships, and it's far less mysterious than most people think. Exhaustion. For many couples, especially those living together or raising a family, daily life comes with a long list of invisible responsibilities: work obligations, household chores, planning meals, managing schedules, taking care of children, remembering appointments, handling emotional conflicts in the family. A lot of this mental load often falls disproportionately on women. Even when both partners are working, many women still carry a large share of the organizational and emotional labor required to keep daily life running. Over time, that constant responsibility drains energy, and energy is the raw fuel of sexual desire. When the brain is overloaded with tasks and stress, the body naturally prioritizes recovery and stability over sexual arousal. Stress hormones like cortisol rise, mental fatigue increases, and libido quietly fades into the background. This is why a woman who feels overwhelmed by responsibilities may still love her partner deeply, still find him attractive, and still value the relationship. But at the end of a long day, her mind and body simply don't have the capacity to shift into a state of desire. She's tired, not uninterested, and this is where many men misread the situation. They interpret the lack of sexual initiation as a lack of attraction. But sometimes the real problem has nothing to do with attraction at all. Sometimes the problem is that her energy has been spent long before the evening even begins. When a woman feels physically and mentally drained, sex becomes another task rather than a moment of connection. And when intimacy starts to feel like another obligation, initiation disappears almost completely. So now you can start to see the full picture. There are psychological reasons, biological rhythms, social pressures, and everyday exhaustion. But understanding the causes is only half the story. The real question is how to change the dynamic. Now that you understand the reasons behind the pattern, the next question becomes obvious. How do you change it? The answer is not about convincing a woman to initiate sex. You don't pressure desire into existence. You create the environment where it can grow naturally. The first shift is removing pressure from intimacy. When every hug, every kiss, and every moment of closeness immediately turns into an attempt to escalate, intimacy starts to feel like a negotiation. But when affection is allowed to exist on its own, without expectation, something powerful happens. Closeness becomes safe again. And once closeness feels safe, she becomes more willing to initiate it herself. The second shift is slowing down the pace of sexual escalation. Many men move quickly toward the final outcome. But when you slow the rhythm of intimacy, anticipation begins to build. Moments stretch longer. Eye contact lingers. Playfulness increases. And over time, that tension starts to move in both directions instead of only coming from you. The third shift is communication. Many couples never actually talk about their sexual expectations. A simple, honest conversation about desire, about what both of you enjoy, what makes each other feel wanted, and how intimacy fits into the relationship, can remove a surprising amount of confusion. Clarity creates comfort. Comfort creates openness. Another important factor is reinforcement. When she does initiate, even in a small way, your reaction matters. Appreciation encourages repetition. If she feels that her effort is welcomed and valued, she becomes more confident expressing that side of herself again. And finally, there is something many men overlook completely. Support outside the bedroom. When responsibilities are shared, when stress is reduced, when the relationship feels like a partnership rather than a burden, energy returns. And when energy returns, desire often follows. Because the truth is simple. Most women don't resist intimacy. They respond to the emotional and physical environment around them. When that environment feels safe, relaxed, and connected, something shifts naturally. She no longer waits for the moment to begin. Sometimes, she becomes the one who starts it. Women rarely initiate sex for reasons most men never consider. It's not always about attraction fading. It's not always about desire disappearing. More often, it's a combination of pressures that slowly reshape the dynamic in a relationship. Sometimes it's the pattern where every moment of closeness automatically turns into sexual escalation. Sometimes it's the fundamental difference in how male and female desire actually works. Sometimes biology plays its part. Hormones, cycles, energy levels that shift throughout the month. And sometimes the explanation is far more human and ordinary. Emotional disconnection, social conditioning, or simply exhaustion from carrying too many responsibilities for too long. When you begin to understand these mechanisms, something important changes. You stop interpreting her behavior as rejection, and you start seeing the environment that shapes her desire. Because attraction inside a relationship rarely disappears randomly. It responds to the emotional climate two people create together. When a woman feels emotionally safe, when she feels appreciated beyond physical attraction, when intimacy doesn't feel like pressure but connection, her defenses start to lower, and something surprising begins to happen. She doesn't just respond to desire, she begins to express it, sometimes subtly, sometimes playfully, and sometimes by being the one who reaches for you first. If this perspective shifted the way you see intimacy in your relationship, make sure you subscribe. This channel is dedicated to one thing: helping men understand the deeper psychology behind attraction, relationships, and female behavior. And now, I'm curious about your experience. Are you usually the one initiating intimacy in your relationship? Or have you found ways to create a dynamic where she starts it too? Share your thoughts in the comments. Because the most honest conversations about relationships often start right there.